if you've heard of the ancient skeptics, then you might have heard of Pyrrho in Pyrrhonian skepticism, or perhaps Sextus Empiricus. And you're likely to be familiar with just how radical they insisted upon living in terms of not having beliefs, not affirming anything. And it sounds crazy on the surface and say, well, how could we possibly live without beliefs? I wouldn't be able to act at all if I didn't believe that, the wall was solid or that I was going to be able to eat food or do what. And that is a common objection. It has been a common objection, even during their own time. So this is not something that they were ignorant of. And when you have something in philosophy like this, where it seems like they're saying something that's just outright stupid or crazy, then odds are pretty good that there is a different way of understanding it that makes it substantially more interesting. And there are explanations for it that include pieces that we're just not considering. In other words, if it seems stupid, you're probably missing something. And that's the case here. Now, what I think is surprising about this is that what we have to remember is that the skeptics and the Stoics and the Epicureans, so those that followed after Aristotle, and so this is in the post-Plato academy, and so the skeptics came to dominate the post-Platonic academy. And during that time, we have to remember that this was also after Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the known world, but he also penetrated into India. And so Alexander the Great would have met Buddhists in person. And so there would have been the opportunity, at least, for, some kind of back and forth in terms of a, flowing from Greek culture to Indian culture and a flowing from Indian culture to Greek culture. And so maybe that's part of it as well. I'm certainly not willing to say, and I'm not claiming that that's all of what's going on here. But at the same time, when people look at Stoicism and say, wow, that looks Buddhist, and when you look at skepticism, especially because skepticism is actually significantly more radical in that way, it really looks Buddhist. And so this idea that, we should live without beliefs, we'll see how it is that their particular notion of assent and belief is actually more like what the Buddhists were doing psychologically. In other words, there's a problem with our terms here. And so the belief that I'm going to be able to sit on a chair without just falling straight through it is different than the belief that this person holds a grudge against me and that I need to plan for the future so that I do da 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 da. In other words, that level of human cognition that is involved in holding grudges, planning for the future, forming judgments about things after they happen, anticipating pain before it happens, maybe even a long time before it happens, especially psychological pain, and then all the abstract thought and that kind of stuff. Those are human qualities. Those are the kinds of things that animals don't do. On the other hand, when a cat jumps up on a chair, arguably it has to kind of in some way understand, maybe believe that the chair is solid. In other words, I have some notion that it's not going to completely give way and I'm going to hurt myself. And you see this with squirrels too, although they do some pretty fantastic things in terms of falling from hundreds of feet in the air, but nevertheless. But that kind of physical understanding of what's going on and that kind of physical belief, if we can call it that, is just not the same as the more human cognitive capacities for what is recognizably like religious belief and, belief in more abstract concepts and higher level cognitive functions. And so that, I think, pushes in the right direction of getting us to understand exactly what was going on. Because with Buddhism, one of the things that is characteristic of Eastern philosophy and characteristic of Buddhism is that you have a distinct saying no, saying no to the way that life is, saying no to our natural inclinations and being human. That I am not going to just kind of go along with things and do all of the same stuff that everybody else does, make all the same mistakes, and hurt myself by doing that. And that's the fundamental psychological underpinning of this, is that desire and our natural manifestations for desire and our natural higher cognitive functions that actually, worry about the future and still, we're still concerned about the past, and we might perseverate about something and just, have it go through our heads over and over and over again, and it's just torturing us. Animals that don't have, memory like that can't have that problem. And in general, that's one of the things, arguably, and I have argued, that we love about dogs, is that when I encounter my dog, he is very much in the present moment. He is right there, man. I mean, he is, happy in that moment, sad in another, and it's just off from one thing to another. And it turns out that, living in the present moment, kind of good, right? Like it tends to help us And we hear this not just in a religious context, but in general from people who are concerned with psychological well-being, that if you're worried too much about the future, especially something that's not likely to happen or not going to happen, or that you can't do anything about it anyway, why bother? Why worry about it? Maybe we should adopt then a perspective of, or a doctrine of, no worries, of, this is the Hakuna Matata thing, right? Of no worries, which is not a coincidence, where, Timon in the film, his name comes from the Pyrrhonic skeptic Timon, who was one of Pyrrho of Elis's followers. But anyway, and no worries is a direct translation of ataraxia. Ataraxia was the principle of this serenity and tranquility that comes from, I see crazy stuff happening out there. I see that the world is subject to all of these kinds of things that I could worry about, but why? Why? This is the, in the modern kind of cheap paperback form of chicken soup for the soul sort of thing. Don't worry about it. Why worry about it? It's not going to do any good. I mean, you don't worry about it when it's raining outside, do you? Who cares? Yeah, it's raining right now. That might not be convenient because I want to go outside and play baseball, but that's okay. I can't do anything about it. It's not like worrying about it's going to do any good. And so that's very much what we get from the Stoics, especially, where a lot of modern people have actually found utility, a great utility in Stoicism. And that's something that we'll hear about when we talk about them with, especially in the 20th century with James Stockdale, now Admiral James Stockdale, but at the time he was a prisoner of war, found great utility in Stoicism. And in general, if you look at, for instance, n-grams and actually look at word frequency in terms of how often people are searching for things or, buying books with things, or how often a word appears in print and that sort of stuff, then you'll find that people are talking about Stoicism more. And they are talking about this era of philosophy more. And so you'll find people who try to identify as Stoics or maybe as skeptics. Stoics is more common, but honestly, what they're doing with Stoicism is maybe even closer to skepticism, because the skeptics continued that radicality into their physics, into their metaphysics, and so on. Whereas the Stoics, they were willing to make positive claims. They were actually willing to say, no, we know things. Here is truth about the physical world, and, et cetera, et cetera. And the skeptics oppose this, but we'll get there. So I think hopefully that will help. And so when people teach skepticism, and we talk about academic skepticism and, the ancient Greek philosophical skeptics, then oftentimes people will lead and say, okay, well, can you live without belief? Is it possible to live without affirming anything, without assenting to anything? And then people will immediately raise up and say, no, it wouldn't be possible to do anything. I wouldn't even be able to get out of bed in the morning. That's the apraxia objection. And apraxia is, not being able to do anything, not being able to act. And so that was something that was current for them. They dealt with this. They responded to it. Once again, if it seems obvious, it's probably not going to be very effective. So when people say, oh, well, Socrates was obviously wrong. Socrates might have been wrong, but he was probably not obviously wrong. That's the kind of thing. But anyway, so with the skeptics, can you actually live without belief? What is it like? What would it look like to live without belief? Well, this is where I think it's helpful to actually borrow a story from Zen. And so there was a monk and a master that were walking along a path one day, and they found a blueberry bush, which is, a good thing to find. I like blueberries. So they found a blueberry bush. And the master said, quickly, name that without naming it. Name the blueberry without naming it. And the first pupil, stopped and was stymied and didn't know what to do. He was phasic. This is what we hear, by the way, in skepticism, that when people first hear about this, they're like, name it without naming it. What do I do? I don't know. And that's because they're still trying to kind of work it out logically. In other words, they're living in the old paradigm of thought. But you can't do that because it doesn't work. I mean, it's a paradox. It's a contradiction. So you can't do that. And so that doesn't work. That student didn't do very well. And then someone who would become quite successful came up and he said, okay, name that without naming it. And he looked at the master very flatly and said, blueberry. Now, that turned out to be the right answer. Why was it the right answer? Because it seems like, well, he named it, he called it a blueberry. But he didn't. And the reason that he didn't is because the sense of what it means to name something. The idea is that the reactive simply being a part of the physical world, if you will, the old brain version of this and interacting with physical objects in the same way that my cat jumps up upon a chair and knows that the chair is going to just fall to the floor. He's not just going to fall through the chair. That base level interaction with physical objects in the world is something that doesn't require naming in the same way. And so that's what's meant by that paradox. That's what's meant by this story, is that it seems like he's naming it, but in fact, he didn't mean the fullness of the abstract concept. He just meant if I'm interacting with that thing, like my, unreflective interaction with that thing, just like an animal might interact with it. It's a blueberry. There it is. Okay, great. And so that, I think, is the difference. And that's the difference in Zen. And it's also, by the way, the difference in skepticism. So that ultimately is how we disentangle what's going on with the skeptics. And the reason that you don't get a lot of this in traditional histories of philosophy is because most of the time they're written by Western scholars, and the Western scholars may not be all that familiar with Eastern thought. But it helps a great deal, I think, because in this case, especially, they're clearly doing the same kind of thing. So anyway, I think that's interesting, and that provides us with a nice introduction to what the skeptics were doing. Now, it's also salient that the skeptics, and really, skeptics, Epicureans, and Stoics, there was a lot of, Socrates is great. Socrates is the paradigm of what it is that we want to get to. And they looked at Socrates as an intellectual forebear. And so it begs the question, well, would Socrates have been a skeptic? In other words, were they really doing something different, or were they just doing something that was distinctly and definitively Socratic? Because not everybody can be right? So, the Cynics said, oh, that Socrates is, one of us. And the skeptics said Socrates is one of us, and the Stoics. And he couldn't possibly have been, right? There has to have been some kind of differentiation. And so the word skeptic comes from skepsis, and skepsis means inquiry. And so this is what the skeptics were constantly doing. They were inquiring into things for the sake of getting to the truth, but then they didn't get to the truth. And the act of not getting to the truth taught them something important, so that they then were able to withhold judgment and get to tranquility. Does this sound familiar, right? If you've done work in trying to understand what's going on with Platonic dialectic, that story is going to sound really familiar, just inflected a little bit, right? Because Socrates did inquire into things, presumably trying to get to the truth. And that's what he said. But we're told that that's Socratic irony, and that he wasn't really necessarily, he didn't think he was going to get there. He knew that, Nicias and Laches weren't going to be able to give him the answer to what courage was. But that was his way of being a philosophical midwife. And so he would kind of buzz around like the gadfly. And this is the typical Platonic stuff, right? So he participated in Socratic dialectic with these people to try and help them. And ultimately, the helping them was the, extirpation of ignorance. And I say extirpation there. I know it's kind of a weird word, but extirpation literally refers to pulling it up by the root. And so when you take a plant and you pull it up so that the whole thing comes out, right? You're weeding something, right? Then you're extirpating. So you are pulling something out by the root. And the idea there is a good process of Socratic dialectic cleanly pulls out this negative thing, and the negative thing is ignorance. And so that's what it is that you see. And then you go on to some kind of insight, and presumably are able to ascend into the forms, although kind of paradoxically and ironically, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the beauty of Plato. But what we get with the skeptics is a more practical version in terms of the language that they use. And so they were inquiring, as Socrates was inquiring, participating in skepsis, into truth, presumably, although some later authors would question just, were they being disingenuous, like they knew that they weren't going to get there, just like Socrates? So there's that. But the purpose of that, the purpose of engaging in that inquiry, was to get to a point where you could see for yourself, you experience firsthand that you need to withhold judgment, because you're not going to get there. Like, it's futile. You're not going to be able to resolve the issue. And when you recognize the futility of the issue, why worry about it? The only good path forward in that case is going to be not to worry about it, because you can't know. And so if you can't know, you can't make any progress with it, then you have to learn to set it down. And so that's a lot of what we get in skepticism, in Stoicism, and so on. All of these very practically oriented post-Aristotelian, post-Platonic philosophies were very much involved in this practically oriented goal of tranquility, just like Buddhism. And you get the same kind of stuff where you have these stories in Buddhism, especially koans and Zen, where people are trying to work through things logically, and they're trying to use their old familiar worldview to make sense of things. And it doesn't work. And you have to see personally that it doesn't work so that you can then, come to that moment of confusion, which is the famous being stung by the torpedo fish thing in Plato's Meno, so that you can go beyond that and embrace a different way of seeing, the world. And that's what the Stoics referred to as a withholding of judgment. And so judgment being kind of characteristically belief, the human cognitive activity that's associated with that sort of function. In other words, that's what I'm trying to, I think the modern language for this helps a little bit because we're accustomed to, kind of differentiating parts of the mind psychologically, parts of the brain, even where we say that there's some localization with respect to function. And so you have, for instance, the new brain, the neocortex, and you have the old brain, cortex, just brain. And so you have the lizard brain that was developed presumably earlier in evolutionary history and, does all this stuff. And then you have the neocortex, which is this kind of wrinkled dinner napkin thing, and sitting on top. And I do mean that, right? But anyway, so that gives us a lot of our characteristically human capacities. But those characteristically human capacities are good for the species. They're good for the genes, a la Richard Dawkins' selfish gene. In other words, they're good for the propagation of the species. But it's pretty clear that they were not meant for the happiness of the individual, right? And certainly not meant for the tranquility of the individual. Because anxiety and fear and all kinds of negative emotion, negative emotion is privileged in terms of evolutionary history insofar as we experience and interpret things negatively more easily than we interpret things positively. So that we tend to be more negatively oriented. We're more willing to believe bad news, not as willing to believe good news. We tend to be willing to believe that things are worse than they've ever have been and that society is degenerating and that, oh my gosh, the roof is on fire. What do we do? Steven Pinker pointed this out recently in saying that, look, life is actually a lot better than it ever has been, but people don't believe the good news because we are inclined not to. And we have a predisposition for actually believing bad stuff. Well, that predisposition for believing the bad stuff and for thinking about the bad stuff, for perseverating, for ruminating on things, for, attaching ourselves to negative emotions. And now this is a more Buddhist approach, right? To attach oneself to negative emotions. I think that's kind of, it may be a coincidental, but an interesting foray, or at least a segue into what it is that we can do with the skeptics. Because the skeptics spoke of grasping, and specifically the Stoic grasping. This is catalepsis. And so the grasping in terms of apprehension. And so apprehension as well literally means grabbing onto something. And so grabbing onto something as a metaphor for understanding is the kind of thing that is, largely universal, which is not a throwaway comment. There aren't very many things that are largely universal, but suffice to say, we think with our bodies. And so the metaphor of being able to get my hand around something and, now I have mastery over this thing because I can grab it and I can do whatever I want with the object. That is something that we find to be naturally analogous to the process of grasping a concept. And so I grasp a concept, I have a firm hold on it, and I can do whatever I want with it. Then I can physically manipulate it just in the same way that I can apply it to other, domains and do whatever I want with that knowledge. And so that grasping is catalepsis. And so the skeptics spoke of akatalepsis. And so we have that same, negating prefix in English. And so that's interesting. And it gives us an idea of what it was that they were opposing and, exactly what was at stake there, which is this, human capacity for understanding in the way that the animals don't have and that the other species don't have. And that in general, we do some good things with that. We create technology and we do, some good stuff and we like what it is that we're able to do with that as humans. But at the same time, it also causes us a lot of problems. And so it's something that's not necessarily always for the psychological health of the individual. And that's what the skeptics were going at, was that, there's a certain form of this which is not necessarily good for you. And that tendency to want to be able to grasp hold of everything and to understand everything, you can't. You're not going to be able to. Not everything in the world is amenable to that sort of grasping, understanding. And so what do you do in those situations? Do you just worry about it? Do you get fearful of the unknown? What do you do? Well, those are all negative responses that hurt you. Why would you hurt yourself if it's something you can't control anyway? And so it's best just to set it down. And in other words, best not to have attachment to those things. And in a skeptical frame, best to withhold judgment so that we can then experience the tranquility that comes with withholding judgment, ataraxia. So that's the idea there, and that's the story of what it is the skeptics were doing. So the Stoics spoke about perceptions, and the fact that you can have perceptions that impinge upon us and they provide a cognitive impression. I mean, it almost sounds like modern philosophy, but this was happening in the ancient world as well, where people were arguing about this sort of thing. And the idea is that the Stoics were saying that we could actually use that as a vehicle for truth, and that was something that we could be certain of, and we could actually accomplish what the skeptics thought was impossible. And so, we should be concerned with doing that. Whereas the skeptics looked at it and said, no, there is a turmoil that is created in those situations. In other words, there is a dissonance, a disharmony. Disharmony is going to be an important word for the phenomenologists. This is like 19th century. This is way later. But at the same time, disharmony is a really good word for this, where you have, a kind of disharmonious combination of perceptions, in the same way that you have a dissonant tone, in music, where you have like a minor second or something where the two waves overlap in such a way that it's not as pleasing to our ears. And so it creates a kind of disharmony, and you want to resolve that disharmony. That's what people talk about in music too, right? And so you go towards resolution into something that is more sonorous and not as cacophonous. So anyway, all right. Now, what's interesting about this is that the difference between Buddhism and Christianity in terms of the practical approaches to try and get to the divine, try and get to enlightenment, or to get to the beatific vision and get to God, the differences are analogous to what we get with skepticism, in contrast to the usual story, at least, what we get with Platonism. And so Plato, we should not be surprised to learn, was used by the Christians and is analogous to what it is that the Christians were doing, in the sense that the typical Christian approach to things is, okay, well, even at a very young age, people are told stories, and, there's something that, and we'll hear this with, Origen and others going forward, is that Scripture speaks even to the smallest child. But what it says to the smallest child is not necessarily something that you're going to keep your entire life. Like, it says something to you that maybe, you got the wrong impression because you were 5. And you're going to have to outgrow that version of whatever it is that you think religion is as you gain more in terms of your wherewithal and ability to think and do things. And so Christianity doesn't have any problem with this, in the sense that you have, certain things at a certain age, and you have certain, spiritual progression in terms of, okay, well, this is what a child thinks, and then you kind of refine that, and you get older, and you refine that, and you get older. And the problem is we don't necessarily commonly realize that it's perfectly orthodox Christianity, and especially Catholicism, it's perfectly recognized as orthodox. But this continues all the way to dispensing with the adult projections as well, and getting to divine unity, where there is no possibility for projections. And also, by the way, no possibility for personality in terms of the God and all these other things. So the religion is actually quite different than you might imagine. But that final divine unity, because God is always spoken of in Christian theology as a unity, a oneness. And so God is being itself, the oneness of, all of creation, that sort of thing. And if God is a oneness, then that oneness there cannot be any different than the emptiness, shunyata, and enlightenment in Buddhism. And so, in other words, you have a kind of Ouroboros, coincidence of opposites, where Christianity goes one way to get there, Buddhism goes another way to get there, but in the end, they both arrive at something kind of like mysticism. And so you have the mysticism of a, St. Augustine, and then Dionysius of the Areopagite, pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, in the 5th, 6th century Syria, and then Eriugena, and then, Meister Eckhart and Thomas Aquinas, and on and on and on. And there are lots of figures in Christian history that do this, and it's very much the same kind of stuff that you get in Buddhism. So the difference is Christianity doesn't have any problem with the projections, and doesn't have any problem with, okay, you have certain stories that you're going to tell these things even to, small children and that sort of thing, and that people will kind of progressively refine and move into different levels of understanding. Whereas in Buddhism tends to be more like, okay, well, no self. This is what's going on, and we want to make sure the Buddha is not divinized, and it's a very different approach that is much more, you have to see it for yourself, vast emptiness, nothing sacred, et cetera, but you have to get out there and see it for yourself. And so the emphasis then is on practice, so that you can go about seeing things for yourself and experience what it is that can't be put into words anyway. And so that's a very different approach, but ultimately getting to, undifferentiated oneness. And so that's the kind of thing that we get. And I would like to draw an analogy to what we have between Plato and the skeptics, because with Plato, it seems like you have a theoria, right? Contemplation, you have a system, You have something that you're building this kind of philosophical edifice where you're describing, here are the forms and here's the divided line and the great chain of being and all this other stuff. Whereas with the skeptics, it's much more of a Buddhist, it's much more of a Zen approach to saying, no, we can't know any of that stuff. And from the very beginning, we know that we can't know. And so instead of going through the, disingenuous Socratic process of pretending that we can know only to knock everything down and ultimately at the end of the day end up not drawing any conclusions, so that you end up with this kind of insight and the insight feeds upon itself. And I mean, at that point, Plato sounds very Buddhist, but the skeptics take a different path to ultimately the same kind of stuff. And they are claiming thereby that what they are doing is actually closer to Socrates than what Plato was doing with it. And Socrates didn't write anything. And by the way, a lot of the early leaders of the academy after Plato also didn't write anything. And they were skeptics. And the idea seems to be that writing conduces to a theoretical understanding. Writing pushes us in the direction of systems and concrete concepts and claims and that sort of stuff. Whereas experience doesn't do this. It doesn't have to do this. And so the skeptics were very focused on experience. Go out there, see it for yourself, be very practical, withhold judgment, figure out what it is that's psychologically good for you, not good for you, practice in the skeptical way, and then you'll get to a tranquility. And so I think that's useful. Hopefully that's a useful way of framing it, if not a, kind of provocative way of framing it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about moving forward in history with academic skepticism. And so this is academic in the sense of Plato's academy. And so the followers of Plato in the academy for some time tended to be skeptics. And some of them were relatively well known. And so you have a little bit of this with, like I said, with Socrates, with, Timaeus's likely story, the idea that we would have to go with something that is likely and somehow that, pushes us in the right direction. Also, leans towards something like this. But so the earliest form of this we see with Arcesilaus. And so Arcesilaus towed the usual skeptical line of not affirming anything. And so you act without asserting. This is what we've been talking about so far. Followed famously by Carneades. And Carneades is interesting, at least insofar as, he was very active in this regard and very, he's a popular opponent of the Stoics. Now, we don't have a lot of writing for the Stoics at that time, but we have people talking about what it is that Carneades did and apparently made a big impression. And what's interesting about this is that it sounds like a sophist. So Carneades, we're told, gave one speech one day in favor of justice, and then one speech the next day for the opposite. And the idea was then to say, if I can be convincing for both of these things, if I can convincingly show a thing and its opposite to you, then you have that paradox. And holding that paradox in mind is a destabilizing influence, and it tends to corrode and destroy, crack and destroy worldviews. And so that's the sort of thing that is useful in a skeptical way for pushing us in the direction of withholding belief. And so that's what's going on there. That's why he was doing that. But that's kind of interesting. Now, at the same time, Carneades seems to be maybe working with a different version of what a belief is, or at least has slightly different things to say in saying that a wise man can hold beliefs if he understands them to be beliefs. In other words, if you can do it without attachment, that kind of pushing in that direction, right? Because that's the sort of stuff that we hear from Buddhism in the same way. So I think that's kind of interesting. Now, Pyrrhonian skepticism. Pyrrhonian skepticism is beginning with Pyrrho of Elis, who is the famous, kind of fountainhead of this tradition. And he's famous for being very extreme in his skepticism. And it might be apocryphal just how extreme he was. There's some debate as to what's going on there. Not a lot of writing. So anyway, but at the same time, there's a kind of interesting story that I think is worth knowing about Pyrrho. And the story is that there was a wagon approaching him in the street that was going to run him over. And that he was so completely unaffected. He was so without any kind of assent or affirmation that a friend actually had to pull him out of the way so that he wouldn't get hit by the wagon. And that's interesting to me. And the reason that that's interesting is because it's really similar to a story that we get in the Indian tradition. And the reason that this is curious is because the story in India is very different than the one that we get with Pyrrho and the wagon. So with Pyrrho, we're told that, he was like exemplifying the extreme of this, not having belief and that sort of thing. And that this might be a good thing. In India, we get almost the opposite approach to this, which is funny, where there's a man who is standing in the middle of the street, and there's an elephant that is approaching, and the rider of the elephant is yelling at the man, telling him to get out of the way, or he's going to be trampled by the elephant. And the man is, steeped in this tradition, and so he's looking around, and he's like, I'm God, the elephant's God, why should God get out of the way of God? And so if we are all divine, then, and so he's kind of stuck in something very different, which is funny. It's at the anyway. And so someone pulls him out of the way, and he says, why did you do that? Why did you pull me out of the way? I'm God, the elephant's God. Why should God get out of the way of God? And the man looked at him and said, did you not hear the voice of God telling you to get out of the way? In other words, the rider. So anyway, I think that's beautiful. But this is kind of an injunction to say that it's possible to live practically, and it's possible to live in a way very much like the cat jumping on the chair. It's possible to live with that kind of practical, wherewithal in the world without necessarily assenting, or without having belief or any kind of problematic judgment, or in a more traditional translation, at least, of Indian spirituality, an attachment. And so it's possible then to be able to get along in the world and to live practically in the world without attachment. And so that seems to be the direction that things are headed. But anyway, it's kind of funny that one of the apocryphal stories for Pyrrho is so similar, but at the same time different in important ways. Okay, so I do want to say something about Timon, and I'm sure that you have the image now in your mind of that character from the movie, right? Because he's a really charismatic little what is he, a meerkat? Is that right? Anyway. So Timon said that it's in our nature to know nothing and to be able to say that things both are and are not. And, he provides in that they neither are nor are they not, and this sort of thing. And so provides, kind of canvassing the paradox, the fullest extent of the paradox of things. And the reason that this is important is because Timon said that this first, when they hear about the paradox, they are first led to be speechless, to be aphasic. So aphasia is to be without speech, be without being able to, say what's going on. And so they first didn't know what to say. And then this teaches them, as they kind of sort things out and see it for themselves, to withhold judgment. And then in withholding judgment and being able to really get good at this and seeing it very thoroughly in the world, you get to ataraxia. And so they get to that tranquility, which is the idea. And that's really interesting, because it's very much the same kind of thing that we hear from Taoism. And so with Taoism does what Zen does with paradoxes. So, and this is arguably why, right? I mean, as Buddhism went with the Bodhidharma into China and became Chan, and then went up into, Korea and to Japan, and finally became Zen. Zen is just the Japanese word for essentially Chan. It's the same kind of thing, same kind of tradition, but it's the combination of Buddhism and Taoism. And so it's a kind of inflection of that culture and that way of approaching things and saying, okay, this is actually really useful. Maybe this is the way to practice. And so ultimately it's all still Buddhism, because it doesn't really matter. You're not teaching Buddhism anyway, which is what we hear, is that you're only learning the way to Buddhism. And so there are multiple ways to Buddhism. And this is the same kind of stuff. There are multiple skepticisms, there are multiple philosophies, there are multiple ways of doing this. If what matters is the end state, very much like Plato, if what matters is the good, or God in Christianity, that sort of thing, then it almost doesn't matter how you get there, It's just that you get there. Whatever it is going to be most efficient for you. And this is why we have so many different flavors, for instance, spirituality and Buddhism. But nevertheless, so that's kind of interesting. And the Tao Te Ching in particular has a lot of these direct contradictions. So do the non-ado. Is that clear in the original Chinese as well? You have the symbol for do, not, and do. And this happens with a number of different things throughout the text. And so that contradiction is meant very explicitly. In other words, it is meant to be a paradox. It is not meant to be the kind of thing that you can disentangle and then tame and make, amenable to your existing worldview. It's meant to be crushing of your existing world. It's meant to, lead you in a direction of destroying your old way of thinking and seeing so that you can make way for one that is, considerably healthier and better and otherwise, and perhaps more accurate or whatever. So anyway, that I think is kind of interesting. And Pyrrho, we're told, had a similar sort of habit of speech in saying that no more, that this is no more good than bad. This is no more this than that, etc. And so that kind of no more principle could be applied to anything in emphasizing and never departing too far from skepticism. In other words, never departing too far from this awareness that we shouldn't be attached to these things, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the whole thing really is very Eastern in a certain regard in terms of the way that this gets practiced. And we even have, for instance, with Anicedemus, the 10 modes. And the 10 modes might strike us as, okay, well, you're enumerating things, and how could you possibly enumerate things if you're just going to knock that down? And aren't you doing exactly what it is that you shouldn't be doing? You get exactly the same kind of stuff in Buddhism, right? And so you have these lists of the, 36 different modes of mind that are doing this, and the, 5 different kinds of happiness, or whatever it might happen to be. And so there's this push to enumerate. And there's this thought that if you enumerate, that does something helpful for us in being able to identify, okay, this is corresponding to my experience now, and I'm going to pull that volume out and say, okay, now what is the practice that accords with that thing to be able to handle it? And so it's a more targeted, method of practice, let's say, in being able to diagnose exactly what's wrong and then be able to take positive steps in that direction. And doing that involves a, psychology. And this is, Buddhist psychology is precisely what I had in mind in this regard. And that's something that encourages us to kind of take the mind apart and try to split things into pieces and understand, what are the parts that are going to be helpful for us and not helpful for us, and how do we do this, and, et cetera, et cetera. This is still in Plato, right? We get this in the Republic with the tripartite soul. And so this, and with the Phaedrus, where you've got, the good horse, the bad horse, the charioteer, and the different, portions of the mind and all of this, and, how should we understand that, and what should reason do, and et cetera, et cetera. And with Plato, what was distinctly human was going to be what was going to help us the most in taming the bad horse, which was this out of control desire that was causing us more harm than good. And with Aristotle, he identified that was specifically human, as in the most quintessentially human capacity is reason. Reason is the stuff that makes us human. That's what, excellence then in virtue, so, or as in excellence in virtue, arete. Excellence in reason is what makes us an excellent human, insofar as reason is what allows us to guide the bad horse, et cetera, et cetera. The skeptic seems to take this a different direction in saying that, okay, well, yes, but at the same time, a lot of what it is that we take to be characteristically human is not necessarily good for us, in the sense that it's doing us a lot of harm, and it might actually be helpful for us not to worry about things all the time, not to be so concerned about the past and the future, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a refinement in a more interior focused way of what Aristotle and Plato were doing. So I think that's kind of interesting. So moving on to Sextus Empiricus. And so now we're moving several centuries forward in history. And Sextus largely, he's a Pyrrhonian skeptic, but Sextus is famous in part, at least, because we actually have his writings. And so you can read him, and that's helpful, because the early skeptics, maybe not so much. And so that makes him a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible in that way. And maybe inhabiting a cultural time and place, a milieu, an intellectual milieu that is actually more similar to our own, and so it makes it a little easier to get into things, et cetera, et cetera. So he says a lot of the same stuff that we hear from Pyrrhonian skeptics for centuries before that. So we're guided by appearances, phenomena, and that we do investigation, skepsis, and that we're looking for tranquility typically. So people want to try and get to a state of, happiness and serenity, but they do this by pursuing truth, not realizing that the pursuit of truth is actually futile. And so it is in the recognition of that futility and being able to set things down, including our attachment to the pursuit of that, that allows for real ataraxia, that allows for real tranquility. And so I think that's actually kind of interesting. And it's interesting insofar as it's analogous to what we get in Buddhism with the story of the poison arrow. And the parable of the poison arrow in Buddhism is where you have a man that's shot with a poison arrow, and a friend goes to, pull the arrow out and get rid of the poison and treat it and whatnot. And the man says, no, stop, don't treat it yet. I need to know who shot it, how far away he was, what kind of arrow it is, what kind of bow he used, what the man was like, et cetera, et cetera. And very quickly we realize, I mean, these details don't make any difference at all. Who cares? Just get the poison out, right? Like treat the wound. And that's the idea in Buddhism, is that metaphysics are like all of those things that really don't affect us, that we don't need to know, and we can't know anyway. And so if you can't know it anyway, and it doesn't make any difference in terms of the problem that you're actually having, why bother? Go on and suck the poison out, treat the wound. Let's deal with the practical reality of things. And that's very much what we get with skepticism, and very much what Sextus tells us we should do. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. All right, so I want to close in talking about the principle of non-contradiction, because this is something that may provide us with a entry point to understanding what separates a lot of the philosophy that was happening after Aristotle. And so Aristotle is famous for insisting upon the principle of non-contradiction and saying that you can't have, something and its opposite in the same time, in the same place, with respect to all the same things, et cetera, et cetera. So you cannot have A and not A. It is a contradiction. Remember that Aristotle developed logic, and the logic that we teach people is syllogistic logic, comes from Aristotle. Now, we've added to it a little, in the last 2,300 years, but nevertheless, it's Aristotle. And so we shouldn't be surprised then that he emphasizes something like the principle of non-contradiction. At the same time, moving towards eventually in, the last book of the Metaphysics, Aristotle's Metaphysics, thought thinking itself. And so he moves toward ultimately a kind of contemplation, a kind of Platonic theoria, which seems a lot more like mystical unity and oneness. And so he kind of departs from this, but anyway, that's more Aristotle than this. But at the same time, he does this and emphasizes the principle of non-contradiction, at least in the service of being able to have successful inquiries into, biology and physics and all the other things. And so this is why Aristotle is the father of science, right? Is that he makes possible a lot of the inquiry that now we recognize as being so valuable. Following Aristotle, however, not everybody bought into the principle of non-contradiction. And so the skeptics famously had a problem with this, in the sense that you had something like Timon's, it both is and is not, which this isn't new with Timon or with the Pyrrhonic skeptics. This is something that goes back to Heraclitus. Heraclitus was also very fond of paradox and contradiction. And Aristotle makes fun of the pre-Socratics in saying that, the followers of Heraclitus are obliged to act as if, they believe that things are and they are not, but they don't really believe this because it's not possible, et cetera, et cetera. And so he has all these terrible things to say about how it is that you're fooling yourself if you think that you're a real Heraclitean. But at the same time, there's a persistent tradition of this kind. And Heraclitus, by the way, also is very similar to Buddhism. And we get those contradictions, those paradoxes in Buddhism, and as I just mentioned, in Taoism. And so that's something that is current in a lot of these traditions. And we get it with the Pyrrhonian skeptics. And so that's something that we should recognize as a kind of departure from Aristotle, not being willing to make these claims. And by the way, even being willing to embrace paradox to dislodge people from their usual way of thinking, so much so that, you're willing to embrace something that sounds like an outright and is indeed an outright contradiction. Whereas with the Stoics, they don't really go that direction. The Stoics are going to make much more, they're going to be much more inclined to make positive claims, and the skeptics and the Stoics would butt heads over that sort of thing historically. So I hope this helps. Skepticism is rich and interesting, but also difficult because it's very easy to misunderstand it. And this is an area that frequently it's hard and it kind of gets skipped over because we don't necessarily have really famous figures that everybody, talks about. I mean, Plato and Aristotle, everybody kind of knows their names. The Stoics, not, or the skeptics, not so much. So I hope this helps to make sense of skepticism in the ancient